Hi, everyone, and welcome to this Center for Security Policy webinar, part of our book series. We'll be talking with the author of our latest work, Who Lost Afghanistan? The great New York Times bestselling author, Robert Spencer. Just waiting for a few more people to filter in to the virtual audience room here, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Nearly 2,500 U.S. service members were killed. More than 20,000 service members were injured. $2.3 trillion were expended. And after 20 years of American military operations, the Taliban government once again governs Afghanistan in strict adherence to Sharia law, while playing host to jihadist groups, including al-Qaeda. Yet there has been, at almost every level of government, no public accounting as to the question, who lost Afghanistan? Who is responsible for this 2 decades of foreign policy failure? To help us answer that question today is Robert Spencer. He's the author of a new book, Who Lost Afghanistan? He's also the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, the author of some 26 books, including New York Times bestsellers, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, and The Truth About Muhammad. Spencer has led seminars on Islam and jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, the United States Army Command and General Staff College, the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council, as well as various elements of the U.S. intelligence community. So, Robert, you were there in the very beginning, briefing, members of the United States Central Command, people that would have to actually go fight in Afghanistan. So we wanted to ask you, just to start off, where did the war go wrong? Some might remember in the early aftermath, after September 11th, the U.S. had largely ousted the Taliban from government in cooperation with the Northern Alliance, and that in just a few weeks. Some argue the outcome of Afghanistan was inevitable. You get this sort of graveyards of empire language talking about the terrain and the geography. And other people say, well, the decision to invade Iraq was what caused us to lose focus in Afghanistan. Otherwise, we could have continued our victory there. But what's your view? When did Afghanistan go wrong?
Kyle, thanks. The problem really started at the beginning. The whole thing was wrongly conceived when George W. Bush decided, and this was along around in November 2001, to continue our presence in Afghanistan, despite the fact that the Taliban had effectively been defeated. It had been driven from power. It had been so comprehensively defeated, as a matter of fact, that Bush and others were referring to it in the past tense at that time, as if it were completely a spent force. But Bush had the idea that he was going to transform Afghanistan into a Western-style secular republic. This was based on an insufficient appreciation of the hold that Islamic law had over the minds of the people of Afghanistan, an insufficient understanding of what Sharia involved, and an insufficient appreciation of how attached the people were to it, ultimately to the detriment of our 20-year adventure there. If we had toppled the Taliban, quarantined the place to the extent that they could not export jihad terrorists the way they did in the run-up to 9/11, then Bush could justifiably have said it was mission accomplished. But the whole nation-building adventure is where it all ran off the rails.
I think you mentioned a little bit about the misunderstanding or failure to understand that the Bush administration from the very beginning had when it came to the nature of Afghan society, and also, I think, in particular, the nature of the jihadist enemy in Afghanistan. And having gotten that fundamental question wrong, and I think this is a major premise of the book, none of the decisions the U.S. made in Afghanistan from that point on could ever really go right. It's almost like, making a bit of a arithmetic error, at the beginning of a complicated math question. Can you give us some examples about how this failure to understand the nature of the Taliban and its commitment to Sharia led to some of these strategic mistakes?
Yeah, absolutely. The Bush administration and the Obama administration after it, and then the Trump administration to a lesser degree, and certainly the Biden administration, they all evaluated Afghanistan according to their own understanding of what Islam is and what role it played in Afghan society. And their view of Islam was heavily colored by what they were being told by Muslim Brotherhood-linked lobbies in the United States. So George W. Bush started the whole thing off on the wrong foot on September 17th, 2001, just 6 days after 9/11, when he went to the mosque in Washington, D.C. and stood there with Nihad Awad of the Hamas-linked Council on American Islamic Relations, one of the foremost brotherhood organizations in the United States, Abdurrahman al-Amoudi, who is still in prison to this day for funding al-Qaeda, but at that time was the head of the very influential American Muslim Council, and other Muslim leaders. And Bush said, of course, famously, Islam is peace, and cautioned Americans about victimizing innocent Muslims, which was certainly true that Americans should not victimize innocent Muslims, but it was a strange thing to be the first takeaway after the 9/11 attack. And it showed that there was a wrong emphasis and that he was listening to the wrong people from the beginning. So based on the assumption that Islam was peace, we went into Afghanistan, and Bush and his people assumed that the Afghans would be happy to have a secular republic, that they would see no incompatibility between a secular republic and Islam, and that secular republic would become kind of a light unto the Islamic world, a sign of what representative democracy could do for a nation in that region. And so this was marked by an exaggerated deference to Sharia. As the fact that there are even women in Afghanistan today who are standing up and saying, we support the women in Iran who are trying to live free and without hijab. There are actually women daring to be brutalized by the Taliban and standing up for that in Afghanistan today. If the Bush administration had said that we stand as we stand in the United States itself for women's rights, for the equality of rights of all people before the law, there would have been many Afghans who would have flocked to our side as a refuge. But instead, we set up this government in Afghanistan, the Karzai Ghani government, that was a Sharia-based government. And the constitution that we developed for Afghanistan imposes Sharia. And so the Afghan people could say, well, we can get Sharia with American occupation, or we can get Sharia without American occupation. And they chose Sharia without American occupation, which was, anybody could have seen that coming. Meanwhile, their misapprehension of Islam led to all kinds of errors in the way that the war was executed. For example, when there were rumors about Qurans being desecrated by American troops, the commanding general at the time, this is along around 2011, issued this groveling video, embarrassing video. It's still available on YouTube. General John Allen saying, I want to apologize to the noble people of Afghanistan that the Quran was desecrated and we hold it in the highest respect and we would never do this intentionally, and so on and so on. And you can understand why they were trying to pacify the situation, but they're looking at it with a mindset of the West rather than understanding how that would appear in Afghanistan as groveling weakness that was to be exploited rather than as a gesture of goodwill that should be reciprocated in kind. And there are so many other examples of this type that show that as you say, that they got the first math problem wrong, and so everything built on that was wrong afterward.
Sure, and that's the same General John Allen who is now immersed in a foreign influence scandal with related to the Brookings Institute taking money from the government of Qatar. So you can see how these things sort of followed us home a little bit. And you made a point in the book that I think is worth noting when you talk about the fact that there would have been people in Afghanistan that would have supported a sort of full-throated American view. And you say, one of the things that the Bush administration was trying to do was avoid having a sort of religious uprising or a religious awakening all across the Muslim world turning against the United States. And you say, well, in fact, there's no reason to believe that would have happened because each of the governments and rulings in each different Muslim states would have had to come to their own conclusions about what their best interests were. And many of them may have sided with us against jihadists. And ironically, of course, that's what we saw happen under the Trump administration with the Abraham Accords, where you had countries like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, start to make decisions about the way they would interact with the United States and with Israel and other members of the region based on their own national interest.
Exactly. And so if we had pursued, excuse me, the same policy in Afghanistan, there's no doubt that there would have been some significant level of support. To assume that everyone in Afghanistan thought the same way, and especially that everyone in Afghanistan adhered to this fantasy version of Sharia and Islam that the Bush administration and later Obama and Biden embraced, it's ridiculous. But this is where we were. Another example of how damaging it was is the number of green on blue attacks. That is, the attacks by Afghan army and police personnel who were being trained by the Americans, and then they turn on their trainers and kill them. And this happened, we don't actually even know, because it's likely that the full number was covered up, but there are hundreds of such incidents. And it all comes once again from a misapprehension of what we were dealing with. If the Bush administration in the beginning had undertaken a thoroughgoing study of Islam as the Taliban understood it, even leaving aside the question of maybe the Taliban gets Islam all wrong, okay, you could even leave open that possibility and still understand what the Taliban is all about. And it was criminal dereliction of duty that this was not done. But if they had done it, they would have come upon the idea that Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, allowed for lying between a husband and a wife to pacify a relationship at home and also in wartime. And he said, war is deceit. So the Taliban had every reason, based on their own governing assumptions, to send people into the Afghan National Army and police to be trained by the Americans and wait for their chance to kill Americans. But we never took account of that possibility in any way, shape, or form, because it would have been Islamophobic to do so. And that was job one, to avoid Islamophobia.
And I think you saw some of the doublethink that this policy created when, after a green on blue attack, they would say, well, it was really due to cultural factors. And then you would say, oh, really? What kind of cultural factors are those? And they wouldn't have an answer. But I want to, you mentioned Islamophobia, and I want to get into this a little bit about how this, how the U.S. policy was influenced on this side. We gave your bio. We saw that, you briefed multiple government organizations about the nature of Islamic law, about jihad, about why it matters when you're addressing Islamic terrorism. So there must have been a time when elements of the U.S. government understood this enough to know that it was worth learning. So what kind of reception did you get in the early days of the war on terror when you started to teach this stuff? And when did it start to change, and why?
Kyle, in the early days, there was a lot of receptiveness. A lot of people in the various government agencies and in the military, when I spoke on military bases, they would say that what I was telling them made sense of what they had experienced themselves while serving in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I heard that many times. But what happened was that there was always opposition within the various agencies and the various military military apparatuses that had me speak. There was never a general acceptance. There was always pushback, and the pushback ultimately proved to be better connected and better organized and better funded than I was. And so what happened ultimately was that in 2010 or 11, the Muslim Advocates Group, which is a Muslim Brotherhood linked attorneys organization in the United States, along with 57 Muslim and South Asian organizations, including the major organizations of the Muslim Brotherhood Network in the United States, the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Islamic Society of North America, all those. They wrote a letter. Farhana Khaira of Muslim Advocates signed it, but it was also co-signed by all these groups. They wrote a letter to John Brennan, who of course was later the head of the CIA, but at that time was in the Department of Homeland Security, and they demanded that I be fired by name. I was kind of flattered that they'd noticed, but at the same time, it was clear what was happening. They demanded that I be removed as a trainer for military and the FBI and JTTF and so on, and that all mention of Islam and jihad and Sharia and any related matter be removed from all counterterror training. And Brennan immediately wrote back, and he not only wrote back, he wrote back on White House stationery. Now, it's not as if John Brennan's office didn't have its own stationery and he had to go down to the White House and borrow some of Barack Obama's. What Brennan was signaling was that what he was saying had the approval of the president. And what he said was that, of course, I would be removed as a trainer and all mention of Islam and jihad would be removed from counterterror training. And it was. And it has never been returned ever since. And this has had a number of results. In Afghanistan, it had the result of hamstringing anyone's ability to do what we were just talking about a few minutes ago, to understand the Taliban on its own terms. Because to get too close, to get too deep into what the Taliban said itself that it was all about, what it was up to, what its motives and goals were, it had to get you into areas that the US government was committed not to going into. And so it was dangerous territory for any military analyst or anybody in the intelligence community, because they could be facing reprimands from their own superiors if they discussed these issues. So the US was essentially blind, willfully blind by its own hand in Afghanistan, in making blithe assumptions that these people had the same priorities, the same outlook, the same desires as Western secular post-Christians have. And there was no basis for that. And there were a number of ways in which that was not so. But this was something that the US government did not dare to examine.
I want to address that, but first I want to remind folks, because I neglected to do so in the beginning, we will have a question and answer period in the last 15 minutes or so of the presentation. You should see a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and that's where you'll type in your question, and then we'll pick some of the best questions we can find for Robert at the end. But Robert, so you talked about how we were willfully blind, and the time period where this happened, the 2010, 2011 time period, I think is interesting because that's also the period where we started to shift in Afghanistan to talk about negotiating with the Taliban. We opened negotiation with the Taliban, not under President Trump. President Trump got a lot of criticism for his negotiation with the Taliban. The reality is we were negotiating with the Taliban very early on, way back in the 2011 time period under Barack Obama. And so we were entering into negotiation with the Taliban with assumptions about what the Taliban wanted and believed that were never true. And we saw this play out even, as we were leaving Afghanistan, where you had, the U.S. negotiators would say, well, you have to have a diverse government that respects the rights of women. And the Taliban negotiator would say, yes, women will have all the rights that they have under Sharia. And the U.S. negotiator would say, great. So, it's just another example there of how this error followed us all the way through, really from beginning to end, but reminding people that negotiation with the Taliban and the idea that instead of forming a secular republic in Afghanistan, and we can talk about the relevance of that, we mentioned a little bit whether that was even possible, but they began very quickly to accept the notion of sort of an Islamist republic for Afghanistan, and an Islamist republic that the Taliban would be a part of. I mean, do you think that some of these internal pressures that you talked about played a role in that change of goal?
Very much so, Kyle. The fact is that the negotiations themselves manifest the same misunderstanding and the same willful blindness, because if they had studied, here again, what the Taliban believed about Islam, and still believes for that matter, I still think that it's very likely that we could go down and walk it through the State Department today and not find anybody in there, not even one person, who has any idea what the Taliban really believes and what they want. And the fact is, if they had studied it, they would have known in 2010 and 2011 that under Islamic law, you only enter into negotiations with a non-Muslim foe under two circumstances. One is if that non-Muslim foe looks as if it is about to convert to Islam. And the second one is if you are losing. If you are losing and you need time to gather strength to fight again more effectively in the future. Those are the only two circumstances under which it is permitted, according to the Islamic law that the Taliban follows, to conclude a deal, a truce, with an infidel enemy. And so the State Department, the Defense Department, the administrations involved should have thought, when the Taliban is willing to negotiate, the Taliban is telling us they're losing because they don't think we're about to convert to Islam. And so that's the only other option. What's that?
I said, let's hope not.
Not yet, anyway. So taking that one off the table, the only other option is that the Taliban wants to negotiate because they're losing. So that would have been the time, if they had understood that, to press forward even harder to final victory and maybe really to obliterate this organization. But instead, they thought, oh, great, isn't that wonderful? They want peace, just like we want peace. And so let's negotiate, without realizing that the Taliban had just told them, by the very fact of the negotiations themselves, that they were in a position of weakness. And so the position of weakness was not capitalized upon. And instead, they were invited in, as you noted, invited into the governing coalition, and ended up ultimately back in power in Afghanistan.
And let's talk a little bit about that ultimate withdrawal from Afghanistan, those last couple of years. I mean, one of the things I think worth pointing out was, in the folks at Long War Journal have talked about this, and the Taliban, to begin with, was gaining power in the provinces. They'd controlled a number of provinces over the years, getting closer and closer to Kabul in 2020, in part because the United States, while it was negotiating with the Taliban, was not attacking them and had created rules of engagement to prevent our forces from targeting them while we were negotiating. So that is sort of the lead up to this ultimate withdrawal from Afghanistan. And little question, of course, that the withdrawal itself was badly bungled. We had billions of dollars in equipment lost. We had American citizens left behind in Afghanistan. And of course, you had those American soldiers killed in an ISIS attack in part because the U.S. had surrendered control of security for Kabul to the Taliban. So my question, Robert Spencer, is who should be held responsible for that failure?
Well, the failure in regard to the withdrawal is squarely the fault of the Biden administration. So the president himself, although nobody really thinks the president is the one calling the shots in this administration, but the president himself should be held responsible, as well as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, above all, and the people who are telling the president what he should do and should not do. All of them ordinarily should be held accountable, but none of them will be or have been, because of course the very people who should be holding them accountable are in the same on the same side. So what you have in the withdrawal is the culmination of all the false assumptions and wrong-headed analysis that had led to us being there 20 years to start with, compounded by the American military's new attention on enforcing ideological conformity within its own ranks. And so all through the summer of 2021, we had the US military having critical race theory seminars and things like that, instead of, obviously, formulating a coherent plan for withdrawal from Afghanistan. And so when it came to be time to withdraw, the Biden administration closed Bagram Air Base in the dark of night and forced everybody to go to the commercial airport, which was setting up for all the disasters that happened as a result of that. If they had kept the air base open, and they could have gotten all the civilians there safely and gotten them out of the country safely, and then gotten the military out of the country safely. To close Bagram Air Base first was just an indication that what we have with General Milley's and Joe Biden's military is a woke, distracted force that is not concerned with what it ought to be concerned with, and is instead concerning itself with all these issues that really have nothing to do with what the military's mission is and ought to be.
I think this is an important point, and people may wonder, well, what does this question of wokeness in the military have to do with, the debate over Afghanistan, or the inability of the government and the military to talk about the nature of Islam and jihad? But I think it has a lot to do with it, because during this 20-year period of fighting in Afghanistan, you had a DoD that was increasingly inwardly focused on managing what its own people thought and what its own people believed. Exactly. And so now you have Chairman Milley talking about reading about white rage and that corruption of the general officer corps, because you had that establishment that of a politicization of what the military and what its members had to believe and to say.
Absolutely. And that really started on September 17th, 2001, when George W. Bush said Islam is peace. And that was not just an offhand quip or an attempt to mollify our Muslim allies, but something that became a cornerstone of American policy. And so that was the first real large-scale exercise in telling our military personnel what to think. And so the military people who brought me in, and others like me, who spoke honestly about the ideological roots of the threat we were facing and what we were up against in Afghanistan and Iraq, they were under pressure immediately for not towing the ideological line of the administration. And this is something that never should have happened in the United States of America. But once that precedent was set, then it was easy to build upon it, as we see how wokeness and this leftist agenda in the military has so quickly become something that is taken for granted that it must be enforced. And this is the fruit of setting a precedent. The precedent was set in the first decade of this century that the military would be the arena for the enforcement of an ideological lockstep, imposed from above, and that was that. And now, once it's been done, it's always easier to do it the second time and third time and fourth time.
Right. And I think the other place where this took place was in the transitioning of language, where instead of talking about jihadists and Islamic terrorists, we started to talk about extremists and countering extremism. And this then made it possible to create an environment where an extremist was an extremist for any number of things, including things that the American people consider very normal and mainstream. Most recently complaining at your local school board meeting. And I don't think enough people understand when this change in our focus took place, but it was during this period, and it was partially due to this need to control what you could and couldn't say about jihad and our conflict with Islamic terrorism.
Yeah, actually,
so
Kyle,
go ahead.
The Countering Violent Extremism program of the Obama administration, which was the Obama administration's counterterror program, actually began in 2011. And that was the program that was put in place when all mention of Islam and jihad was removed from counterterror training. What replaced it was this amorphous violent extremism that was never defined in any of the government's literature about the terror threat, which just opened the door for the way that it's being misused now, to that anybody can be called an extremist, and now enemies of the administration that are its legitimate political opposition are being branded with this label. This is another ball that was started rolling in the controversy over what exactly we were dealing with in Afghanistan and Iraq.
I think that's right. Continuing on the theme of the Afghan withdrawal, one thing the Afghan withdrawal did achieve was to bring in large number of Afghan refugees. Now, initially we were told that the withdrawal was focused on removing American citizens from Afghanistan. It was focused on removing those Afghans who had worked very closely with our military and our government, people like military interpreters and the like, and that everyone who was being evacuated from Afghanistan was being very closely vetted and very heavily vetted. And of course, it turned out later that, in fact, none of that was true, that American citizens and what are called special interest visas were not being prioritized. In fact, what was being prioritized was bringing in the maximum number of Afghan refugees possible, and that there had been almost no vetting taking place. How should we think about this element of the withdrawal, Robert? The Biden administration's seemingly willful deportation of large numbers of unvetted Afghan migrants at the expense of American citizens.
This is yet another betrayal of the American people by the Biden administration. The Afghans who were brought in, some counts are that there were up to 124,000 of them. The Department of Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas has admitted that they were not vetted. The vast majority of them were not vetted. Even those that were vetted against criminal and terrorist databases that we have of Afghan people. But those are just lists of names. And there was a brisk business in false identifications in Kabul toward the end of our presence there. And so it's not even certain that the people who were vetted were really vetted. In other words, they're not the people they claim to be, so they weren't really screened at all. Of course, the administration would never dare to try to ascertain from actual questioning of these people what their attitudes and assumptions are regarding Islamic jihad, regarding Sharia, and so on, because here again, that would be Islamophobic. But we've brought in now this large population of people from a culture that is vastly different from American culture. Now, a lot of people will object to that and say America has always been a melting pot, always been a place where people from many cultures have come. You yourself are the children of immigrants, and so on and so on. And therefore, you have nothing to say about this. But insufficient attention here again is being paid to the fact that Afghan culture is not quite as different as, or is actually far more different from American culture than, say, Polish or Italian or even Algerian or Moroccan culture. Afghan culture in the first place is strongly based on Islamic tenets that include things like the sexual abuse of children, child marriage, the sexual abuse of young boys in particular. And these things, even it's a terrible scandal among many, that the American government was aware of all this during our presence in Afghanistan and actually ordered American personnel not to give our putative Afghan allies trouble if they were, for example, molesting a little boy or something like that, because it was their culture. But now they're here, and we have already had several of the migrants arrested for spousal abuse, which is taken for granted as acceptable in Afghanistan, sexual abuse of children, including young boys, and so on. This kind of thing was entirely foreseeable. But here again, nobody, even in the refugee resettlement apparatus, is paying any attention to it, because to do so would be Islamophobic. And so we are setting these people down in American communities, many of whom are essentially ticking time bombs, and American people are going to be victimized, but no one can talk about it, and no one can do anything about it.
All right. I remember there was an article that came out from, I forget what the publication was, but it was by a woman who had worked in refugee centers in Europe, and during the quote unquote Syrian migration crisis. But of course, many of them were not actually Syrians at all. They were coming from all over the world, including from Afghanistan. And she said, even uniquely among that population, the Afghans were particularly hard to try to assimilate. That's where they got large numbers of sexual assaults and other issues. And this was someone who was not predisposed to this opinion. This was what she learned by dealing with the population. And of course, to even mention these kinds of things was completely unacceptable. Nor could you mention the fact that they were being brought to military bases, and then they were freely allowed to leave. There was nothing you could do to keep them there until they had been vetted. And so, yeah, Robert, I appreciate your handling that issue, because it's an issue that people don't really want to talk about, but I think it's important.
And of course, there's also the possibility, if not the likelihood, that we brought over some Taliban and ISIS guys, because here again, war is deceit. If you've got deception at the heart of your military approach, and then you've got a power that you consider to be hostile, offering free passage to people who want to come into the United States, you'd be stupid not to take advantage. And they're not stupid. And so I think it's virtually certain that we brought jihadis over here who intend to victimize American people. And unfortunately, we're only going to know that for sure when it happens.
Right. I remember, I think it was last year, there was an alert that went out in Alexandria, Virginia, regarding concerns that there were jihadist terrorists who were part of the evacuation flights and were now apparently targeting a mall or something like that. Nothing ever came of it, but it was suddenly shocking to see the admission that, oh yeah, this might be a real problem. And of course, there were British intelligence assessments of Taliban and al-Qaeda people being picked up, and ISIS people being picked up as part of these flights, and several in the United States as well.
Yes, and yet nobody is talking about this in the public square. It seems as if nobody wants to handle the political implications of what that might mean. Everyone is preferring just to whistle in the dark and hope for the best. And that's really how it's been since, as the book shows, that's how it's been since 2001, and how the entire Afghanistan misadventure was handled.
So obviously, we've talked about the failure in Afghanistan, what led up to it, 20 years really of refusing to recognize the nature of the enemy we were dealing with. Obviously, the failure of Afghanistan has told us something larger about the viability of nation building in the Muslim world. But I wonder, Robert, in a world today where many people have taken their eyes off of the Middle East, they've taken their eyes off of the nature of the jihadist threat or terrorism in general. But is there a larger national security lesson that we can draw out of our 20 years in Afghanistan, in your view, that we should be focused on in moving forward?
Kyle, I suppose the answer there is in what you were saying about the fact that most Americans think that this is all over, that the jihad threat is something that we had to be concerned about in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, but they got lucky that day and they're not going to get lucky again, and we have nothing really to be concerned about. The persistence of the Taliban, the fact that it did not die when so much pressure was brought to bear upon it, but it was able to rally and ultimately retake power, is an indication of the persistence of the Islamic jihadis. A few years back, I wrote a book called The History of Jihad that really is a 1400-year record of that persistence. And it shows that when jihadis did suffer a loss and a setback, they never, in any instance, gave up and said, well, okay, it's all over, we won't wage jihad anymore. They just bided their time, gathered their strength, waited out the foe, and struck again when the times were propitious. This is a lesson that nobody in the American public sphere seems to have learned from this entire affair. But the fact that there are Taliban operatives running the government in Afghanistan today is living proof that it's true, and that the jihad threat continues. Unfortunately, because of so many domestic policies, it's actually greater in the United States than it was in the aftermath of 9/11. And we're going to find that out one day, one way or another.
Robert, thank you. Let's now turn to Q&A. We've got a couple of good questions in our Q&A chat, and if you, as we go through these, if you think of one, please feel free to go ahead and put your question in as well. We'll do as many as we have time for. Let me start off with this question. Years ago, the question reads, the U.S. Army published area guides for each country. They were not ideological and offered a pretty good assessment of culture and ethnicity, etc. Is our intelligentsia not capable now of presenting realistic information rather than magical thinking from our leaders? Robert, are we capable of doing this?
I don't think so. I've seen some of the area guides that were published in recent years, and while they still have useful details and all kinds of helpful information for getting along day to day in a given area, they don't contain, now you noted in the question that they were not ideological to start with, but nowadays when ideology is playing such an important role in countries such as Afghanistan, in the way that we ought to approach countries such as Afghanistan, we're leaving our troops completely ill-equipped to deal with many, many things that they might encounter there. And I remember speaking to military personnel on many occasions about their time in Afghanistan and Iraq, and how it was a common thread universally that they were not equipped for what they saw. And they weren't told how to understand what they saw. And so much of what they saw was justified in Islamic law, but this was never discussed by the people who were training them and sending them into these places in the first place. So yeah, I would say our intelligentsia now is simply not capable of presenting realistic information. There needs to be a complete change at the top. and a transformation in the thinking in the Defense Department and the State Department, and the complete sweeping out of what is mainstream thinking today in favor of a more courageous realism that doesn't bow to political correctness and political considerations here at home, but just assesses things as they are.
Next question is about the abrupt pullout. And they ask, with the pullout last year and the abandonment of ammo and vehicles, weapons and planes, how much danger does that really pose to the American people or other allies in the region? I mean, do we have to be worried, Robert, about a Taliban that is now well equipped with arms?
Yeah, actually we do, Kyle. You know, I saw so many people saying, oh, it doesn't matter. It's a shame that all that was left there, but they don't know how to use it. Well, you know, the Taliban, they don't exist in a vacuum. And the Chinese, they know how to use all those things. And they're happy to step in. They've already stepped in many ways economically. They're happy to step in and train them. Not long ago, there was a helicopter accident. A US Black Hawk helicopter went down as Taliban personnel were operating it. And here again, the news was greeted with ridicule and people saying, see, they don't know how to use these things. And as if it's some sort of comic opera situation. But these guys, well, you know, there are accidents when Americans are training also. And the fact that the accident happened in itself is an indication that the Taliban are training to use the material we left behind. And that is going to have effects in Pakistan, in India, maybe even elsewhere as well. But the Taliban have already announced their intentions of exporting their jihad, and we gave them the means to do so.
I want to ask this question, or really it's kind of a comment because it gets to something we talked about earlier. It says, my son, an officer in the army, served in Afghanistan and in Syria. He observed that soldiers on the ground, while tactically successful, were cynical about the overall nature of their mission. While first premises are wrong, it's hard to find the right road. Our leaders are woke and foolish. I wanted to read that comment because I wanted to get to this, Robert. How do we distinguish between the everyday soldier that served in Afghanistan, served in Iraq, have served in the other places in the global war on terror that we asked them to serve, and the leadership that we're criticizing here? Because I think we do need to make a distinction there. Was everybody clueless, or did some people who were a little bit closer to the fire understand what was going on and they were badly served by their leadership?
You know, Kyle, to a man, when I spoke to military personnel who served in Afghanistan and Iraq, they knew exactly what they were dealing with. And they were deeply frustrated and often quite angry with the leadership that hamstrung their ability to counter the foe that they met in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this was not a failure of the American military. This was a failure of the civilian leadership and the military leadership, but not a failure of the rank and file military personnel. Every time the American military met the Taliban in Afghanistan and were allowed to fight, they won. The Americans did. But they were so restricted and so poorly led by the American leadership that those victories were altogether too few. And ultimately, we ended up losing the whole thing. But the American military has nothing to, the American military personnel who served in Afghanistan and Iraq have nothing to be ashamed of. They could have brought both to a successful conclusion, but were not allowed to by their leadership.
A question about the motives of our leadership. This fellow says, hello, and thank you, Mr. Spencer, for your continued instruction over the years. My question is, was it feigned naivete from former President Bush about the nature of Islam and jihad, or is it possible that he had some other strategic purpose or some other intention in laying this groundwork for the American understanding of Islam?
As near as it can be discerned, it seems as if President Bush was trying to ensure that our allies in the Islamic world, notably Saudi Arabia, would not be incensed by his framing of the conflict, but would be able to join in the conflict on their own terms without believing that they were compromising something that was near and dear to them. And that's all well and good if it had just remained on the level of rhetoric and not interfered with the ability of our military and intelligence agencies to evaluate the threat, to understand it properly, and then to deal with it adequately. But it did. And so you don't have to say that he had some nefarious intent in doing this. He had every good intention of trying to keep this from coming to be a wider war with maybe the entire Islamic world, which would have been a massive world war. But as it turned out, because of this, he ended up handicapping our efforts in the ways that we've discussed in this webinar so far.
Here's a question I think is useful. We talked a little bit about some of the wages of this failure. This question is, have we learned our lesson, or will we lose Africa in the near future as well? What is the state of the jihad in the world now, Robert? What are the major battlefields? This questioner asks about Africa in particular. But have we learned our lesson, and where are the current jihadi battlefields that matter?
Kyle, in the first place, when the Islamic State, ISIS, was driven out of Iraq and Syria by the Trump administration, it regrouped in Africa, primarily in three areas, or two areas. West Africa, Nigeria in particular, where the Boko Haram group, a jihad group that has been operating there for many years, rebranded itself, or a faction of it, rebranded itself as the Islamic State West Africa Province. And really, it's been quite extraordinary because they have been able to essentially, with impunity, gain control over a large part of the northern part of the country and expand their operations out into the surrounding countries, Niger, Cameroon, Burkina Faso, and others. Meanwhile, there's another Islamic State affiliate in Mozambique that has taken control of the northern province of Cabo Delgado, which is the site of some very important oil wells. And so that has very serious implications. The third is not an ISIS affiliate, but an al-Qaeda affiliate in Somalia, Al-Shabaab. And they also are acting with essential impunity at this point. And so you have West Africa, East Africa, and South Africa, all very powerful and growing jihad groups. And so that could mean that you'll see a recrudescence of the ISIS caliphate in Africa. And meanwhile, have any lessons been learned? No lessons have been learned. Nothing has been learned in Washington. The same people who are responsible for the catastrophe in Afghanistan are still in power. They're still making policy, and they're still making policy based on all their false assumptions that led to the debacle in Afghanistan. So that means it's likely to recur in Africa and elsewhere.
Excellent summation of where we stand now. I want to ask this last question, and it will be our last question because I think it's a good question to end on. What would victory in Afghanistan have looked like? What should it have looked like?
Well, you know, I kind of touched on that briefly at the beginning, saying that if we had quarantined the place, if we had bombed the al-Qaeda training camps, put them out of commission, and prevented jihadis from leaving Afghanistan, maybe that would have involved preventing anyone from leaving Afghanistan. And then, people would say, oh, this is terrible. You can't do this. And there are human rights considerations and so on. Unfortunately, in wartime, you have to make some hard choices. If we had done that, then I think that's the best kind of victory we could have hoped for. We can't transform Afghan society and make it into Cleveland, Ohio. It's never going to happen. And we shouldn't have spent $1 trillion, however many trillions and 20 years and 2,500 American lives trying to do that. We should have prevented Afghanistan from taking its jihad outside Afghanistan, and that would have been victory enough.
Thank you, Robert. Spencer, thanks to our audience today. I do want to remind them or let them know that Robert's book, Who Lost Afghanistan, is available on Amazon.com. You can find it either by looking up Robert's name or looking up our name, the Center for Security Policy and Center for Security Policy Press on Amazon. It should come right up. It was doing pretty well in the counterterrorism section of Amazon's rankings the last time I checked, and we'd be very grateful if folks would go ahead and get a copy, and if they find it valuable, leave us a 5-star review. We thank you for your attendance today. Robert, Spencer, thank you very much for helping us look at this question, who lost Afghanistan?
Thank you, Kyle. Much appreciated.
All right, thank you, everyone. Stay tuned and check out securefreedom.org, securefreedom.org. If you enjoyed this webinar and you'd like to see more of what we are up to, both in our writings and in our webinars, and thank you so much. This has been the Center for Security Policy. I'm Kyle Scheidler.